When we think of prisoners of war from the Second World War, certain images dominate our collective memory. We picture Allied airmen in German stalags, the horrors of Japanese POW camps, or the systematic murder of Soviet soldiers by Nazi Germany. But there is another chapter of this history that remains largely untold, a chapter written in the frozen wilderness of Siberia and sealed away in Soviet archives that are only now beginning to reveal their secrets. This is the story of the women who vanished. The end of World War II in Europe came on May 8, 1945, when Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. Across the continent, millions of displaced persons began the difficult journey home. Prisoners of war were liberated from camps, forced laborers were freed, and refugees started to return to what remained of their homes. The joy of victory was tempered by the devastating toll the war had taken, with entire cities reduced to rubble and families torn apart by 6 years of unimaginable violence. But for tens of thousands of people, the end of the war did not bring liberation. Instead, they found themselves transferred from German captivity directly into Soviet custody. The Red Army, advancing westward through Eastern Europe and into Germany itself, encountered millions of foreign nationals, soldiers and civilians alike, who had been caught up in the Nazi war machine. Among them were women who had served in various capacities, some as military personnel, others as auxiliaries, nurses, or resistance fighters. Their fate would become one of the great hidden tragedies of the post-war period. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophically during the war. Estimates suggest that between 27 and 30 million Soviet citizens died, more than any other nation. Entire regions had been devastated, their populations killed or displaced, their infrastructure destroyed. As the Red Army pushed into German-held territory, Soviet authorities were determined that Germany would pay for the destruction it had wrought. This desire for retribution would have profound consequences for anyone captured by Soviet forces, regardless of their actual role in the war. Stalin's orders were clear. All able-bodied Germans and those who had collaborated with Germany were to be rounded up and sent to the Soviet Union for reconstruction work. This wasn't simply about repairing war damage, it was about revenge, about extracting labor from those deemed responsible for Soviet suffering, and about asserting Soviet power over the territories it now controlled. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, began systematically identifying and arresting anyone who might be useful for labor or who might pose a political threat to Soviet control. Women were not exempt from these roundups. Soviet forces captured female members of the German military auxiliaries, including those who had served as Flakhelferinnen, or anti-aircraft auxiliaries, communications personnel, and administrative staff. They arrested women who had worked in Nazi organizations, including the NS Frauenschaft, the Nazi Women's League. They detained nurses who had served in Wehrmacht hospitals, regardless of their actual political beliefs. And they imprisoned women from countries throughout Eastern Europe who were accused of collaborating with the Germans or of belonging to anti-Soviet resistance movements. The journey to Siberia began in makeshift transit camps established throughout Eastern Europe and Eastern Germany. Women were separated from their families, often with no opportunity to send word of their fate. They were loaded onto freight trains, the same kind of cattle cars that had transported millions to Nazi concentration camps, now repurposed to carry prisoners eastward. These journeys could take weeks or even months, traveling thousands of miles across the devastated landscape of Eastern Europe, through the Ural Mountains, and into the endless expanse of Siberia. Conditions on these transport trains were brutal. Women were packed into unheated cars with minimal food and water. There were no sanitary facilities, just a hole in the floor of the car. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Those who died during the journey were simply thrown from the trains at the next stop, their bodies left by the tracks. Many women arrived at their destinations suffering from dysentery, typhus, tuberculosis, or frostbite. Some never arrived at all, their deaths unrecorded, their families never informed. The gulag system that awaited them was a vast network of labor camps spread across the Soviet Union, but concentrated particularly in Siberia and the Far East. Established under Lenin and dramatically expanded under Stalin, the Gulag imprisoned millions of Soviet citizens alongside foreign prisoners. The camps served multiple purposes. They isolated political prisoners and other perceived enemies of the state. They provided virtually free labor for massive construction projects, mining operations, and industrial facilities. And they instilled fear throughout Soviet society, a constant reminder of what happened to those who fell afoul of the regime. For the women POWs, their camp assignments varied. Some were sent to mines where they worked underground extracting coal, copper, or other minerals in conditions that were barely survivable. Others were assigned to logging operations, cutting timber in the Siberian forests where winter temperatures could drop to -50 degrees Celsius. Many worked on construction projects, building roads, railways, or factories with minimal equipment and inadequate clothing. Some were sent to agricultural camps, where they worked the land in regions where the growing season lasted only a few months each year. Life in these camps was defined by a relentless struggle for survival. The women were given minimal rations, usually consisting of watery soup, small portions of black bread, and occasionally a bit of salted fish or porridge. The daily calorie intake was barely sufficient to sustain life, let alone support the grueling physical labor demanded of the prisoners. Malnutrition was universal, and starvation was common. Women's bodies began to shut down, menstruation stopped, hair fell out, teeth loosened, and skin developed a peculiar translucent quality that prisoners came to recognize as the mark of approaching death. The cold was another constant enemy. Siberian winters are among the harshest on Earth, and the prisoners were provided with inadequate clothing to face them. Many wore the same thin garments they had arrived in, supplemented with whatever scraps of fabric they could scavenge. Felt boots, when available, were precious items that could mean the difference between keeping one's feet and losing them to frostbite. Women worked outside in these conditions for 10 to 12 hours a day, their hands cracking and bleeding, their lungs burning from the frigid air. The barracks offered little protection from the elements. These were typically long wooden structures with rows of plank beds, sometimes arranged in tiers. There were no mattresses, just bare wood, and prisoners were given thin blankets that did little to ward off the cold. The buildings were often drafty, with gaps in the walls and roofs that let in snow and wind. In winter, water froze inside the barracks, and women woke with frost on their faces. In summer, the same buildings became stifling hot and infested with mosquitoes and other insects. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Camp infirmaries, when they existed at all, were understaffed and undersupplied. Serious illnesses or injuries often meant death. Women suffered from scurvy, pellagra, and other diseases of malnutrition. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through the camps, the disease thriving in the overcrowded, poorly ventilated barracks. Injuries from industrial accidents were common, and without proper treatment, even minor wounds could become infected and fatal. Pregnant women faced particularly grim prospects, with many dying in childbirth or shortly after, and their infants rarely surviving more than a few months in camp conditions. The psychological torment was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. The women had no idea how long their imprisonment would last. They received no letters from home and were not allowed to send any out. They had no way of knowing if their families even knew they were alive. Many had left children behind, and the anguish of not knowing what had become of them was unbearable. Some women simply gave up, losing the will to live, and within weeks or months they were dead. Yet even in these horrific conditions, the human spirit proved remarkably resilient. Women formed bonds with one another, sharing resources, protecting the weak, and maintaining some semblance of humanity in an inhuman place. They organized secret schools where educated women taught others to read and write. They held clandestine religious services, praying together, despite the risk of punishment. They celebrated birthdays and holidays as best they could, saving tiny portions of their rations to create something special for these occasions. They told stories, sang songs, and recited poetry from memory, creating culture in a place designed to strip them of their humanity. Among the prisoners were women from across Europe. They were Germans, of course, but also Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, Balts, and others. Some had fought against the Soviets, others had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were young women barely out of their teens and older women in their 50s or 60s. There were former soldiers and women who had never touched a weapon. There were convinced Nazis and women who had opposed Hitler. There were aristocrats and peasants, intellectuals and factory workers. The gulag was a great leveler, reducing everyone to the same desperate struggle for survival. The category of prisoner that generated particular cruelty were women who had been part of anti-Soviet resistance movements. In the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Poland, partisan groups had fought against Soviet occupation both before and after the German invasion. When the Soviets returned in 1944 and 45, they were determined to crush these movements completely. Women who had supported the partisans, provided them with supplies, or served as couriers were hunted down relentlessly. Many were tortured before being sent to the camps, interrogated brutally to extract information about other resistance members. Once in the gulag, they were often separated from other prisoners and subjected to additional hardships. The Soviet authorities maintained that these women were being held as part of reparations for war damage or as war criminals who needed to face justice for their actions during the conflict. But this justification was thin and inconsistently applied. Many of the women had committed no crimes by any reasonable definition. They were guilty only of being on the wrong side when the war ended, or of belonging to national or ethnic groups that the Soviets viewed with suspicion. The imprisonment was collective punishment, and it extended far beyond any legitimate accounting for war crimes.
Back in their home countries, families desperately sought information about their missing loved ones. In Germany, which was divided and occupied by the victorious powers, the fate of prisoners in Soviet hands became a major humanitarian issue. The International Committee of the Red Cross attempted to gain access to Soviet camps to verify conditions and compile lists of prisoners, but the Soviet government refused these requests for years. They denied that they held significant numbers of civilians, and they certainly did not acknowledge the conditions in the camps. The German Red Cross, working with limited resources in a devastated country, tried to compile records of missing persons. Families would arrive at Red Cross offices with photographs and descriptions, hoping for any scrap of information about their missing daughters, mothers, sisters, and wives. In most cases, there was nothing to tell them. The women had simply vanished. For the families, this uncertainty was its own form of torture. Were their loved ones alive or dead? Should they hope or should they mourn? Years passed without answers. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as the Cold War intensified, the plight of these prisoners became increasingly politicized. Western governments raised the issue of prisoners in Soviet camps, but their own moral authority was compromised by the fact that they too had engaged in questionable practices regarding displaced persons and prisoners after the war. The Soviet Union dismissed Western concerns as propaganda, pointing out that Western powers had repatriated millions of Soviet citizens to the USSR against their will, many of whom had been sent to the gulag or executed upon their return. The women prisoners themselves had no voice in these international debates. They continued to labor in the camps, watching their youth slip away, their health deteriorate, their hope fade. Some died there, their bodies buried in unmarked graves or simply left in the permafrost. Others survived years of imprisonment, only to die shortly after release, their bodies too damaged by malnutrition, overwork, and disease to recover. And some, against all odds, endured. The process of release, when it finally began, was agonizingly slow and arbitrary. After Stalin's death in March 1953, there was a gradual relaxation of some of the most extreme policies of his regime. The new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev began releasing some prisoners, though this process was selective and incomplete. German prisoners of war, including some of the women, were among those gradually repatriated as part of negotiations between the Soviet Union and West Germany. The first major release came in 1953 and 54, when the Soviet Union agreed to return some German prisoners as a gesture of goodwill. but the process was chaotic and incomplete. Women who had been held in camps for 8 or 9 years suddenly found themselves on trains heading west. They were given minimal documentation and often no information about where they would be sent or what awaited them. Some didn't even know if their families were still alive or where they might be, as Germany itself had been divided and millions of Germans had been expelled from territories in the east. When these women finally returned to Germany, they found a country transformed. The Germany they had left no longer existed. It had been divided into east and west, with families split by the new border. Cities had been rebuilt, but the country they remembered was gone. Many returned to find that their families had given them up for dead and moved on. Husbands had remarried. Children had been raised by others. Parents had died, never knowing what happened to their daughters. The returnees were like ghosts, stepping back into a world that had learned to exist without them. The reception they received was often cold. In West Germany, the focus was on reconstruction and looking forward, not dwelling on the past. These women represented an uncomfortable reminder of the war and its aftermath. Some were accused of having deserved their fate for supporting the Nazi regime, even though many had been too young to make such choices, and others had never supported Nazi ideology. In East Germany, those who returned faced interrogation by the Stasi, the East German secret police, who suspected anyone who had spent time in Soviet camps of being compromised or recruited as spies. The psychological trauma these women carried was profound and largely unacknowledged. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not well understood at the time, especially not in women. The returnees struggled with nightmares, anxiety, depression, and difficulty forming relationships or trusting others. Many found it impossible to speak about their experiences, both because the memories were too painful and because they felt that no one would understand or believe what they had endured. They were expected to simply reintegrate into society and get on with their lives, and many attempted to do exactly that, pushing their trauma deep down inside, where it would fester for decades. But not all the women were released. Thousands remained in Soviet camps throughout the 1950s and into the 60s. Some were serving extended sentences for supposed crimes against the Soviet Union. Others were simply forgotten, lost in the vast bureaucracy of the gulag system. And some had become so institutionalized, their health so broken, that they were effectively unable to leave even when technically permitted to do so. The fate of non-German women POWs was often even grimmer. Women from the Baltic states found that their countries had been incorporated into the Soviet Union, and returning home meant continuing to live under Soviet rule with the stigma of having been imprisoned. Hungarian, Romanian, and other Eastern European women returned to countries that were now Soviet satellites, where they faced suspicion and discrimination as former prisoners. Some chose to remain in Siberia rather than return to countries where they would be permanently marked as enemies of the state. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, as the Cold War continued, the story of these women was largely forgotten in the West. The focus shifted to other issues and other conflicts. In the Soviet Union, discussing the Gulag remained taboo, and those who had survived it learned to keep silent about their experiences. Archives remained sealed, and any serious research into what had happened to prisoners of war in Soviet custody was impossible. It was only with the policy of glasnost, or openness, initiated by Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s that researchers and journalists finally began to gain access to Soviet archives and to hear the stories of survivors. What emerged was staggering. The full scale of the Gulag system was revealed, along with the stories of millions who had been imprisoned, including the foreign prisoners of war. Organizations began compiling lists of the dead, identifying burial sites, and documenting the conditions in the camps. Survivors, now elderly women, began to speak publicly about their experiences for the first time. Their testimony revealed the full horror of what they had endured. They spoke of friends who had died beside them, of the constant hunger and cold, of the arbitrary cruelty of guards, of the years stolen from their lives. They described how they had survived by forming close bonds with other prisoners, by maintaining hope even when it seemed irrational to do so, by holding on to their humanity in a place designed to strip it away.
The testimony of these survivors also revealed the extent to which their stories had been deliberately suppressed. Soviet authorities had classified information about foreign prisoners, destroying or hiding records that might reveal the full truth. When prisoners died in the camps, their deaths were often not properly recorded, or the records were kept in archives that were inaccessible even to family members seeking information. This systematic concealment meant that thousands of families never learned what happened to their loved ones. Researchers combing through newly accessible archives found fragmentary evidence of individual women's fates: a death certificate here, a camp register there, a transport list from 1946. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to piece together the story. Organizations like Memorial, the Russian human rights group dedicated to documenting Soviet repressions, compiled databases of victims. German organizations worked to identify missing persons and inform surviving family members of their relatives' fates. But many questions remain unanswered. The exact number of women prisoners of war held by the Soviet Union after World War II may never be known. Estimates range from tens of thousands to over 100,000, but the lack of complete records makes precision impossible. The number who died in captivity is similarly uncertain, but it was certainly substantial, possibly the majority of those imprisoned. And there are still women whose fates remain completely unknown, their names appearing on transport lists, but never on release records or death certificates. They simply vanished. The physical remnants of the camps where these women suffered are mostly gone now. Some sites have been preserved as memorials, but many more have been abandoned to the Siberian wilderness. The barracks have collapsed, the fences have rusted away, the guard towers have fallen. Nature has reclaimed these places, covering the sites of so much suffering with grass and trees, but the ground itself remembers. In the permafrost, bodies remain, some still unidentified, unmarked graves of women whose names may never be known. In recent years, there has been an effort to memorialize these forgotten victims. In Germany, memorial plaques have been erected honoring women prisoners of war who died in Soviet captivity. Museums have created exhibits telling their stories. Historians have published books and articles bringing their experiences to light. Documentaries have been produced featuring interviews with the last surviving prisoners, racing against time to record their testimony before they pass away. But this recognition has come late, too late for most of the women themselves. By the time their story began to be told publicly, most were already dead. They lived out their lives carrying the burden of their experiences largely in silence, receiving little recognition or support for what they had endured. For their families, the memorialization efforts provide some measure of closure, but nothing can restore the years that were stolen or fill the absence left by those who never returned.
The story of these women raises profound questions about justice, memory, and the way societies deal with the aftermath of war. These women were victims of larger forces beyond their control, caught between competing totalitarian powers and suffering terribly as a result. Their imprisonment was a violation of international law and basic human rights, yet there was no accounting for it. No war crimes trials, no reparations. The Soviet Union never acknowledged wrongdoing, and Russia, as its successor state, has been reluctant to fully confront this history. The selective nature of historical memory is also striking. While the world knows about the POW camps run by Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the fate of prisoners in Soviet camps remains relatively obscure. This is partly due to Cold War politics, which made it difficult to investigate or publicize Soviet crimes. It is also due to the intersection of gender and militarism in how we remember war. Women's experiences of conflict have consistently been marginalized in historical narratives, and women prisoners of war doubly so, as they fit neither the heroic narratives of military service nor the civilian victim narratives of war crimes. For the women themselves, the question of how to integrate their experiences into their identity was deeply challenging. Some chose to speak out to ensure that what happened to them would not be forgotten. They gave testimony to historians, spoke to school groups, wrote memoirs. They wanted the world to know what they had endured and to ensure that such atrocities would not be repeated. Their courage in breaking the silence was remarkable, especially given the indifference or hostility they often faced. Others chose or felt compelled to remain silent. The trauma was too great, or they feared being misunderstood, or they simply wanted to protect their families from the burden of their experiences. Many women never told even their own children the full story of where they had been and what they had suffered. They carried their memories alone, a private horror that they bore until their deaths. Their silence was not weakness, but a form of survival, a way of protecting themselves and others from pain that seemed too great to share. The children and grandchildren of these women have their own complicated relationship with this history. Many grew up knowing only that their mother or grandmother had been away during some period after the war, with vague explanations about being held by the Russians or being caught up in the war's aftermath. Only later, sometimes not until after their relative's death, did they learn the full truth. The discovery of what their loved ones had endured was often devastating, bringing both admiration for their strength and anguish at their suffering. Today, as we move further from the events of World War II, the urgency of remembering these stories becomes more acute. The last survivors are now in their 90s or have already passed away. Soon there will be no living witnesses to these events. We are approaching the moment when this history will pass from living memory into written history, when the flesh and blood women who suffered in Siberian camps will exist only in documents, photographs, and the accounts they left behind. This transition makes it all the more important to ensure that their stories are preserved and told. These women were not abstract historical figures, but real people with hopes, fears, loves, and dreams. They were daughters who missed their mothers, mothers who grieved for children they would never see again, young women whose lives were derailed just as they were beginning. They endured conditions that would break most people, and many of them survived through sheer force of will and mutual support. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship is a testament to human strength and solidarity.
The story of the women POWs who vanished after World War II is ultimately a story about the importance of bearing witness. For decades, these women's experiences were erased from official histories, their suffering denied or minimized, their voices silenced. But the truth has a way of emerging even from the frozen ground of Siberia, even from sealed archives and suppressed memories. Through the painstaking work of researchers, the brave testimony of survivors, and the determination of family members seeking answers, this hidden chapter of history has finally been brought to light. As we reflect on this history, we must ask ourselves what lessons it holds for our own time. The capacity for cruelty that the gulag system represented did not die with Stalin or end with the Soviet Union. Today, around the world, there are people imprisoned without due process, forced to labor in harsh conditions, subjected to treatment that violates basic human dignity. There are still women whose stories are not being heard, whose suffering is being ignored or actively concealed. The specifics differ, but the fundamental patterns of abuse of power, dehumanization, and the silencing of victims remain disturbingly familiar. The women who were imprisoned in Siberia after World War II would want us to remember them not as passive victims, but as people who fought to survive, who supported one another, who maintained their humanity in inhuman circumstances. They would want their story to serve as both a warning about what happens when power is unchecked and human rights are disregarded, and as an inspiration, showing that even in the darkest circumstances, the human spirit can endure and ultimately prevail. The Siberian silence is finally being broken. The women who vanished are vanishing no longer from our historical consciousness. Their voices, preserved in testimony and archives, speak to us across the decades, telling us of what they suffered and how they survived. It is our responsibility now to listen, to remember, and to ensure that their story is not forgotten again. In doing so, we honor not just these particular women, but all those whose stories have been silenced by violence, oppression, and the convenient amnesia of those who would prefer not to confront uncomfortable truths. The wind still howls across the Siberian tundra, but now it carries more than just echoes. It carries the voices of women who refused to be forgotten, who demanded that their story be told, who insisted that their suffering and their strength be recognized. In memorializing them, we acknowledge the debt we owe to those who came before us, who endured so that we might learn from their experiences, and we commit ourselves to creating a world where such stories need not be repeated, where the dignity of every human being is respected, and where no one vanishes into silence again.